We are back, Remembering Dynasty, bums, and a whole lot more with Peter Golenbock. Peter Golenbock is here. Ralph Tyko, I am that guy, is here. And guests are Marc Weiss from Brooklyn and Alan Blumkin from Brooklyn. And the topic of the show, for the most part, is going to be the wonderful book Peter wrote along with Graig Nettles of the New York Yankees. And we're going to ask Peter stuff. And basically, I'm not. Basically, Marc Weiss and Alan Blumkin are. So we're going to start. We're going to take turns. Marc Weiss, Peter Golenbock, you've talked about this with me off the air. One of the Graig Nettles book is one of the books you've read from cover to cover. You're a big fan, and you're a maven. You're a baseball maven yourself. So ask Peter what you'd like and go from trade off back and forth.
Well, I want to say, Peter, I did read the book from cover to cover when it first came out. Actually, I've read almost all of your books, so I guess that makes me a fan as well as someone who's going to ask some questions today. But when the Graig Nettles book came out, the rumor on the street was that Graig was supposed to have been traded or at least go somewhere else before the book was released, but then the Yankees re-upped him for a year, and that kind of made things a little uncomfortable, I guess, for him, and then the Yankees eventually traded him to San Diego. Is that rumor actually true, or that's just a coincidence how that all occurred?
Well, it's funny. I really had to chase Graig to do this book. I mean, sometimes you have to call a guy and ask him, 2 or 3 or 4 times before they finally agree to do it, and that's the way it was with Graig. And you know what I figured out after a while? I had the sense that Graig wanted to go home to San Diego. That Graig really, like so many of the Yankee players, was really tired of having to play for George Steinbrenner, who was very much a Donald Trumpian kind of a character. In other words, everybody who played for Steinbrenner at one point or another sort of felt his wrath, Steinbrenner's wrath. And if they weren't feeling, if a particular player wasn't feeling his wrath, they were angry because their teammates were victims of his wrath. And I got the feeling towards the end that really when we were writing balls together, that one of the things he wanted to do was he wanted to leave. So when he ultimately ended up in San Diego, I wasn't surprised. That was not a surprise. My sense of it was that he was just really sick of playing for Steinbrenner.
Do you think a lot of that might have had to do with the fact that he had been with the team prior to Steinbrenner arriving, and most of his friends and teammates, for one reason or another, had left, and so he was one of the last men standing from that kind of original group that it had run its course for him? Or did he just figure that, maybe the Yankees were on the downside and he didn't have a lot left in his career and he wanted to go somewhere and win?
No, I don't think it had to do with going somewhere to win. I think he wanted to go home. I mean, San Diego, from what I understand, was where he lived. In fact, there was a point I went to visit him at his home in San Diego, and he and his wife were very, very happy, living there. He was acquired from Cleveland by Gabe Paul during the 2 years when Steinbrenner was, serving a life sentence for being involved in the Watergate scandal.
Was that when he gave the big attaché case full of money over to the Nixon campaign?
Absolutely, absolutely. What he had actually done was that he had, in addition to that, he had 8 of his employees. He paid 8 of his employees who then wrote personal checks to the Nixon campaign. The idea being that at the time corporations, since the new ruling with this new Supreme Court, corporations now can give money to campaigns. But prior to that, before Citizens United, corporations were not supposed to be giving money to presidential candidates. To get around that, George took 8 of his most trusted employees and said, look, I'm going to give you, say, $5,000. You take the $5,000 and you write a $3,600 check to the Nixon campaign, and that way they won't know that I gave the money. And, of course, he got caught. And so this was Bowie Kuhn at the time, gave George a lifetime sentence to be out of baseball, which, of course, because George was an owner of a team, was really only 2 years. And during those 2 years, George's general manager, Gabe Paul, who really was a very talented guy, managed to get from his old Cleveland Indian team, managed to get Chris Chambliss and managed to get Graig Nettles and a couple other guys who were very helpful to the Yankees, pennant and World Series wins starting in 1975. Or was it 6?
6 was the pennant where they lost in 4 straight to Cincy.
To the Reds, yeah, okay. 76, 77, 78, and 81. Those were championships won under with Gabe Paul's brilliance to put that team together. So by the time Greg and I wrote this book, which I believe was the 1981 season, if I'm not mistaken, he had been there since 74, so he'd been there a bunch. He'd been there a while. He was just tired of it.
He got there in 73, and he was there for 10 or 11 years at that point, and everyone had come and gone, and I think the Steinbrenner Act probably wore thin, and he wasn't that type of guy. He was a no-nonsense guy.
Didn't Thurman die in the plane crash? Was that in 79?
79.
Yeah.
August of 79.
Yeah. And that may have played a part in it too. He and Thurman were very close friends. In fact, he had ridden with Thurman in that airplane, and he begged Thurman to get rid of that plane. I mean, that was too much plane. That was a jet plane. Thurman had a less fast plane before that was, seemingly so much safer. When Greg wrote in this thing, he told me that he just, he was hoping that Greg would get rid of the plane, but of course he didn't do it. So, yes, different guys came along. They did win in 81, and then, Greg he'd had enough. He had just had enough.
Now, some folks felt that he was really soured when they lost in 81 to the Dodgers, and Steinbrenner had that, I guess, faux fight in the elevator with somebody.
Yeah,
and
everybody was. All those players were, because, I hate bringing up Trump again, but Trump's deal, more than anything else, is to be a headline in the paper the next day. To say the most outrageous, crazy things you could say, but if you can be a headline in the paper the next day, then you're successful. And Steinbrenner could have been Trump's twin. Could absolutely have been his twin in that regard, because what Steinbrenner wanted more than anything else was to have his name in the headlines the next day.
And
the way
they both treated employees was incredible.
And they both treated their employees terribly.
Terribly, contractors with Trump, the way these people that are building up his buildings and they don't get paid and what have you.
Yeah.
Just exactly the same kind of mentality as you've told me, Peter, that Steinbrenner manifested from the days in Cleveland, let alone...
That's right. No, that's absolutely true. I mean, Steinbrenner was a truly terrible person, but when you're wealthy, people tend to see you not as a terrible person, but as being eccentric. And that's the way it was with Steinbrenner. Nobody ever said to themselves, here's a guy who fired, managers 15 times and fired general managers 15 times and fired their PR guy 15 times, and then said, as a result, obviously there's something wrong with this guy. I mean, that's
Peter, I've always contended that if Steinbrenner wasn't suspended twice, the Yankees wouldn't have had the mini dynasty in the 70s and the big dynasty in the late 90s.
Well, you're very, very smart. I mean, the book, George, this book, George, that I wrote, absolutely made that as one of the most important points of the entire book. That if Steinbrenner had not been suspended twice during the 30 years he owned the Yankees, they never would have won anything, and I mean literally anything. He would have traded away Derek Jeter. He would have traded away Mariano Rivera, who he hated. They would have traded away Bernie Williams, who he hated because he thought he was gay. They would have traded away Jorge Posada because he didn't like him because he was a rookie, and they would have traded away, Pettit away for the same reason. But because,
think about it. Think about it. The most famous line from Seinfeld is, "How could you trade Jay Buhner?"
Every time I see that, I have gales of laughter and I fall on the floor. And what you're not telling your listeners is that George Steinbrenner in that Steinfeld episode goes to tell George Costanza's parents that George is dead. Okay? George is dead. That's why
right.
George came. They couldn't find George. He thought George was dead. So he goes into the Costanza household and tells George Costanza's father, "Your son is dead." And the first line out of Costanza's father's mouth is, "How could you have traded Jay Buhner?" Which is
more like, "How could you trade Jay Buhner?"
which in the context
doing this, being outraged, the hair going.
Maybe the funniest line in the history of television. For Yankee
definitely the
fans,
signature line of the series.
What?
Except Elaine's line when the dingo ate your baby.
Well, there's that. I mean, there's so many. There's just so many. I mean, the thing about Seinfeld, what I loved about George Steinbrenner and Seinfeld is that somebody inside the Yankee organization was obviously feeding the Seinfeld people things that went on in Steinbrenner's life. I may have mentioned this before, but every day Steinbrenner would eat the exact same lunch. The exact
calzone.
Same lunch. Well, it wasn't a calzone, it was something else. But the fact on Seinfeld that they made it a calzone was so hysterically funny. And the one time that Kramer was supposed to bring him his calzone, and then he got sick, and then the mailman was supposed to bring it, but he didn't bring it because it was raining that day. I mean, you can't find funnier episodes anywhere in the history of television.
Oh, Peter?
It made it.
Can I ask you one question, please?
Yes.
Sure.
Was there an awful? You find that the Yankee players had an awful lot of resentment when Reggie Jackson was signed for 4 or 5 times more than anybody else on the team was making?
They didn't resent him because of the money he was making. They resented him because when he was interviewed by Bob Ward, who was writing an article for Sport Magazine, that Reggie, who was a very, he had very little self-esteem, Reggie. Had very little self-esteem. And despite the fact that he had led Oakland to 4 championships, this was a marvelous baseball player. But as a human being, he was lacking. So he's being interviewed during spring training by Robert Ward. And Reggie has the balls to say to Ward that Thurman Munson is not the leader of the Yankees. Now, Thurman had been leading the Yankees for a while. I mean, Thurman Munson was beloved, and I mean beloved by all of his teammates, by Thurman and Ron Guidry and Sparky Lyle. All of these people loved Thurman. So Reggie comes onto the team, and he says to Robert Ward, Thurman is not the leader of the Yankees. I am. I am the straw that stirs the drink.
Yeah.
Thurman Munson can stir it, but he can only stir it bad. Now, this jackass says this in a locker room filled with people who loved Thurman Munson. And this article came out.
His first spring training.
Yes, he hadn't been there a week when he sat down with Ward, and he went on like this for 5 pages. And naturally, when the magazine came out in, I don't know, May or June, it spread like wildfire through the clubhouse. Yeah. What this
didn't he deny it at first?
What he said at first was that he had been misquoted.
Yeah, like Lockley.
And Thurman's answer to that was he was misquoted for 3 pages.
Yeah, by
Bob Ward is a good friend of mine and is a very fine journalist, and he didn't misquote a word of it, and everybody knew it. And so Reggie, when that article came out, Reggie had exactly one friend, the backup catcher on the team, who now does
Fran
the
Healy?
Hall of Fame.
Yeah,
Fran Healy.
Yes.
Fran Healy, who now does all the Halls of Fame on the TV. Anyhow, for some reason, Fran Healy, I guess, who had no other friends himself, he was the one who became Reggie Jackson's friend on that team, while everybody else, Billy Martin especially, absolutely hated his guts. Billy did not want Jackson as the guy that Steinbrenner signed. Billy wanted Joe Rudi. We had a lot of left-handers on the Yankees at the time, and Joe Rudi was a righty batter and a really fine outfielder, and Billy knew that Reggie Jackson was a less than stellar outfielder. And Billy's philosophy was always to start with pitching and defense. And so he wanted Rudi. The problem with that was that George Steinbrenner wanted stars. He wanted glitz. He wanted all-stars. He wanted power. He wanted headlines. We'll go back to the headlines business again.
Back page of the Daily News.
He wanted the back page of the Daily News. And the guy who was going to give him the back page of the Daily News was Reggie Jackson. So in a way, if you look back on what happened, George wasn't, that far off. Reggie had a huge impact when he played for the Yankees.
And I think Joe Rudi had a poor impact when he moved over to, I think it was to California, to Boston. He didn't play well over there.
Yeah, he went to the California Angels, and his career was kind of toward the end.
That Finley team could have won a lot more if Finley hadn't started with the whole Catfish Hunter thing, and then he broke up the team because when they entered free agency because he didn't want to sign anybody.
Well, the funny thing is about Finley is that what people don't understand, he was another guy with incredible arrogance.
Oh, yeah.
This free agent business didn't exist at the time that Catfish Hunter signed the contract with Finley. And as part of the Catfish Hunter contract, the deal was that Finley was going to put in, say, $50,000 every year towards a retirement fund that Catfish had. Catfish was a very smart guy in so many ways, and he wanted Finley putting into his retirement fund, which was in the contract. And at the end of the year, Finley hadn't sent the money. So Catfish said to Finley, if you don't pay the money, I'm going to go and become a free agent. And Finley, in his arrogance, in the same way that Bowie Kuhn had his arrogance, didn't think they could do it. They just didn't think that would happen. And of course, they went to arbitration, and the arbitrator said he had a contract, and Charlie Finley didn't fulfill it, and therefore you're a free agent. And I think the single smartest thing that George Steinbrenner did was sign Catfish Hunter. I mean, what a difference that man made! What a fantastic player he was for the Yankees.
I think the way they describe it, like Catfish,
he added a lot of class to it. I mean, sometimes That's what it takes in a clubhouse, and that was.
He added a huge amount of class to it. Never mind the fact that he was one of the 3 or 4 best pitchers in the whole league. I mean,
right.
this guy led Oakland to championships. And Finley was just arrogant and stupid in a way. I mean, Finley was a brilliant guy, but this was a really stupid thing to do.
Yeah.
Nobody had ever heard of free agency, and he just didn't think it would ever happen. The same way Bowie Kuhn never thought it would ever happen.
I guess the best way
Marvin
to look
Miller.
at it is,
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say Finley really started the ball rolling by not making that payment, and he started the ball rolling for free agency, which was the ultimate demise of his dynasty, and he had a dynasty. He could have won 2 more at least.
No two ways about it. But the 2 people who started the one person who we cannot fail to talk about, the one person who changed the entire game of baseball was Marvin Miller. Marvin Miller was the smartest person ever involved in the game of baseball. Marvin Miller was a flat-out genius. And
he should be in the Hall of Fame.
Well,
no question he should be in the Hall of Fame.
In the Hall of Fame, crying out loud, they should have a statue of him sitting outside the Hall of Fame. And the players,
I heard a story.
Go ahead.
I heard a story that not only was he a genius to get free agency, but they wanted to make all the players free agents, and he was smart enough to say, let's only have like a certain amount each year as free agents, because he knew that could drive the market.
And that was his genius. That absolutely was
genius.
Genius. Well, you start with 2 guys, Messersmith and McNally, who played out their whole season. They played out their whole season without signing a contract. Their contracts were renewed. He never signed a contract. So Miller had the 2 of them go to arbitration. And the arbitrator ruled that the reserve clause was horseshit. That just because you sign a contract, that doesn't mean your contract rolls over to the next year, which is what had happened ever since it came into being. AJ, let's see, who was it? The White Sox owner. 1884.
82. The guy was the owner of the Boston team in the National League. He was
in the National League. The smartest Spalding. Al Spalding was the guy who came up with the reserve clause. This was a brilliant move.
The guy along the Boston Red Stockings.
No, it was Spalding. It was Spalding. I'm telling you, it was Spalding.
Okay.
Came up with the reserve clause. And the deal was, in the reserve clause, that if you signed a contract, automatically, they wrote this into the standard contract, that if you signed a contract, automatically your contract was renewed for the next year. And what that meant was that if the player didn't re-sign with the same team in the next year, he was out of baseball. There was no negotiating power at all. It was the smartest thing that anybody ever did in terms of owners of baseball teams. And it took Marvin Miller. It took Marvin Miller in 1977 or 8. Seven. When Messersmith and McNally played out the season without signing a contract. Bowie Kuhn again was so arrogant he didn't think in a million years that he would lose when they went to arbitration, when Peter Scythe ruled that when the contract was over, it was over. And that's what he then freed everybody. And here's what
the infamous Sykes decision.
The Sykes decision. Of course, they fired Sykes the next day.
Yeah. Of course they did.
Naturally. But the brilliance of Marvin Miller that you're talking about was Marvin Miller said, we'll only free people who played, say, 6 years. And there were a couple of stipulations, so that really there were only 13 players who became free agents.
But the amazing part about it is the owners felt like he was giving them something good.
The owners were idiots.
Well, they were, but they thought he was giving them a bargain. Because they thought everyone was going to be free, and oh my God, what do we do?
Well, you're exactly right. And if everybody had been free, I would venture to say that, yes, salaries would have gone up, but they wouldn't have gone up nearly as fast as they went up this way. Because you had some of the premier players who were now free agents, and you had players like owners like Steinbrenner, who had no interest in playing ball with the other owners, who were willing to pay so much more money than anybody had ever paid before. So when they paid Reggie Jackson, I don't know, $2.6 million and gave him a Rolls Royce, everybody was flabbergasted. But the fact of the matter was, 10 years later, every star player was making $1 million. 20 years later, they were making $10 million. And that was all because of Marvin Miller. All because of him.
Peter, the agents, the players also, when they had the collusion in the 80s, the owners wound up paying a ton of money when they did that because they were, it was held to be illegal and the restraint of trade and all
that. But again, that's the same arrogance. That's the same arrogance. They hated free agency so much. They hated the idea that the players had some sort of dagger hanging over their heads. They just decided, well, screw you guys. We're going to do what we want to do. And of course, what ended up happening after they took them to court is that it cost them so many more $1 million more than if they had just gone ahead and paid a reasonable salary. They had all-stars who they refused to sign. It's like, what are you guys doing? Did they think they were going to pull the wool over everybody's eyes that nobody would notice?
But that's what happens when absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Well, okay.
Prior to that,
that's right.
Prior to that, the only time the owners really gave out any money was when the American League was formed in 1901 and when the Federal League came into existence in 1914, 1915. Every time other than that, they used the Depression to depress salaries. They used World War II to depress salaries. And Finley had this episode in 1972 with Vita Blue. The Vita Blue coming off that sensational season.
Absolutely. Well, he at one point tried to sell 3 players. He sold one of them to the Yankees and 2 of them to the Red Sox, or the other way around.
It was Rudy and Fingers to the Red Sox, and
that's right.
And that deal
Vita Blue to the Yankees.
And Vita Blue, I thought it was Vita Blue to the Reds.
No.
He eventually he canceled the Vita Blue deal to the Reds after he canceled the Vita Blue deal to the Yankees.
Yeah,
he tried to deal them twice.
But on the same day that they traded the other 2, they traded Vita Blue. Same day, because I know this because I was working at the Bergen Record that day, and I was working there as an editor. But the editor said to me, "This is a very important story. Will you write the story for the first front page of the paper?" Okay, so I sit down at night, and I'm writing how baseball is a revolution and how it's changed, and these players are going from one team to another. To wake up the next morning to find Bowie Kuhn canceled the whole thing. So all of my posturing was bullshit. It was right. Yeah.
Can you give us some insight into Marvin Miller, how he, what his background was, and
sure I can.
Yeah, please.
Sure, I love.
We know so little. I was wondering if you ever considered writing a book on him.
Well, Marvin and I, he came to me, and we were going to write a book. We were going to write his book. And
really? Wow.
Oh yeah, we sat and we talked for several hours, and he was enthralling. I've got the tape somewhere. And then we sat down to make a deal. And I, I wasn't greedy. You take 2/3, and I get 1/3, which is, very often the other person gets 60% and I get 40%. But every once in a while, if you're dealing with somebody who you want to do a book badly enough, you'll go 2/3 and 1/3. Marvin, being Marvin, tried to get it down to 80% and 20%. and I just, as much as I wanted to do it, I was insulted.
I can imagine.
So I knew exactly how the baseball owners felt. If you know what I mean.
Now, I would say that it is insulting, and it's also self-defeating. He'd have been in the Hall of Fame. He'd have been in the Hall of Fame had you written.
He did a book with somebody else, and it was a perfectly decent book. I mean, I have enough ego to think that my book with him would have been a better book, but that's neither here nor there. He wrote his book, and I've got it here on my shelf. It's a perfectly fine book. but it would have been a wonderful experience. Part of being a writer is having the experience. And it was funny because I interviewed Marvin for something I was doing. I think it was the Steinbrenner book. I interviewed Marvin. We had a marvelous talk. I mean, the guy is utterly fascinating. Marvin Miller came out of the United Steelworkers. He was somebody who was negotiating for the Steelworkers Union with the car companies.
Wow.
And he was beating them to death. He was just smart. And when the baseball players came to him, was Robin Roberts was the primary guy. Robin was a very, very smart, savvy guy. And he thought that Marvin Miller would be the perfect person because the people they had before Marvin were all co-opted by the owners. They were just terrible.
Right.
And the thing about Marvin was that he was basically uncorruptible. He had a point of view about what needed to be done, and he would not compromise. And so he never sold out his players, not in the whole time he was there. And that's why several times either the owners locked out the players, or for a couple times the players would go on strike for 3 days or for a week, because Marvin knew that the only way that he could get the owners to even negotiate with him would be if the players went on strike.
Amazing. He was a Brooklyn Dodger fan from what I've read, and
yes, he was.
He was just, he just knew the game, but he was a shrewd negotiator. And I heard someone once say that while the owners were playing checkers, he was playing chess.
He was
probably translates to him being 3 steps ahead of them or 5 steps ahead of them.
Well, clearly so. So. I mean, Marvin and I would talk about the owners, and basically he would say, "I can't believe how stupid they were," and especially more than anybody else, Bowie Kuhn.
Well,
Bowie Kuhn
would say the same thing.
He was a lackey, though.
Bowie Kuhn's an idiot. That sort of thing. Bowie Kuhn just.
Well, Finley would say the same thing about him. And did. I think he called him the village idiot. He called Kuhn.
Oh, Kuhn. Yeah, well, that's because Kuhn vetoed his, $4 million in money that he would have made if he had been able to send Rudy and Fingers and Bida Blue, across the country.
Story about Bowie
I'm sure he voted for him before he shut down his fire sale.
Do I hear a story about Bowie Kuhn?
Sure.
He was at that first Sunday night World Series game in Cincinnati in 1976, when it was freezing.
Yep.
He was sitting there with no top coat and about 25 pairs of thermals.
Right.
And so the next year, I'm at the All-Star game at Yankee Stadium in 1977. I'm in the upper deck. It's like 105 degrees. So he announced Bowie Kuhn's there, and I shout at the top of my lungs, "I wonder if the SOB is wearing an overcoat to show people it isn't hot." I got some laughs around the area that where I was seated.
Okay.
I think the joke is what's the word of an age.
Yeah.
I don't think it translates.
Jim Bouton loved Bowie Kuhn because he made him a millionaire.
No, Jim Bouton hated Bowie Kuhn.
No, but he
hated him.
Well, Kuhn came out against the book.
Yeah,
it became a bestseller.
No, it would have become a bestseller anyway. Didn't matter. I mean, but you're right. What Kuhn did was really, really stupid.
He made him more popular by making him apologize.
Did you know Leonard Schechter, Peter?
Yeah, sure did. In fact, if you've seen my book,
then you know that he was basically the writer of that book. I mean, they were
no question.
They were
a team.
They were a good team,
and he were a team, and a marvelous team. It was the smartest thing that Jim ever did.
Schechter had a wonderful sense of humor. He was so good.
I love that guy.
He and Coppett both had columns in the Post at the same time,
True, but Coppet was a very serious guy who cared more about statistics and that sort of nonsense than anything else. And Schechter talked about the people. Schechter was sort of a guy who had a sort of a jaundiced eye. You know, he never took the owner's side of things. He was always questioning what the hell was going on, and I loved that guy. He was just tremendous. Tremendous. He and Bob Lifside were my two favorite writers of that particular period.
I've had Bob on my program. I'd like to get him as a guest for your show, Peter. Would that be okay? I'm sure.
You can get anybody you want for this show. Anybody. Well, I'm happy with whoever you bring.
Except that New York guy from WFAN, right?
Yeah, except for him.
Okay.
Who, the heavy-set arrogant guy?
Yeah, the heavy-set arrogant guy. Schmuck.
I have no idea who he is.
Francesa.
I'm glad because I who what. Well,
my beef with him was that he was apparently fairly close to Jim Valvano, and so for the next 6 months after my Personal Fouls book came out, he would be knocking me on the radio for the one thing or another.
He has canonized really? Jim Valvano.
He has.
I think that might not be an understatement.
No, it might not. No, it's true. Valvano was the most crooked guy in all of basketball, and everybody knew it. That was the funny thing. So when Personal Fouls came out, it was not a surprise to the people who knew him. It was only a surprise to the people who were, in a sense, a victim to the canonization by the press.
Oh, ESPN lionizes him also.
Well, ESPN hired him. I mean, I fully understand ESPN.
He's one of their guys.
Well, he
was like him and Dick Vitale.
He and Vitale were their two basketball guys, and they were brilliant. Jim Valvano was more perfect for television than he was for basically anything else, because he was a salesman.
I always felt like he should do an infomercial.
Well, he did. He did an infomercial for basketball every day with ESPN. And the sad thing.
Do you know who I preferred was Dr. Jack? Dr. Jack was terrific.
Yeah, Jack was terrific, but he didn't have Valvano.
But he's not glitching.
Pizzazz. Yeah, Valvano had a lot of pizzazz.
Yeah,
unfortunately, he got cancer and he died, which was a terrible, terrible thing. And ESPN, had him on, and he comes out and says, never give up and never give in. And he's raised $1 billion for cancer research, and you got to give him that.
Hey, before we go, I want to just plug Leonard Schechter's book, one of the favorite, my top 10.
Schechter's.
It's called the Leonard Schechter's book. Then we'll plug your book. We'll
have to plug my book.
Plug all your 10 books, but Leonard Schechter's book, The Jocks.
Yeah, I have that. I've read it a number of times.
Not Schechter's book. I don't think The Jocks was Schechter's. It was.
No, I think
it was Schechter. I've read that a number of times.
Was it Schechter's?
Yes.
I've got it sitting behind me. Schechter.
It was
Schechter.
No,
that's right.
I just wanted to mention a real good one. Now let's mention
it's a very good book.
10. Let's mention some of the 10 bestsellers. I was thinking Tony Curtis. Tell us a little bit. We don't have much time. Give us something about Tony Curtis that enticed you to write the book.
He was Tony Curtis. What more do I need to entice me to write the book? It was Tony Curtis.
Okay. Did he come to you, or did you go to him?
Well,
he came to you.
Well, I mean, it's hard to know how these things work. He had an agent, and I was doing a book with the same agent, and I had written a proposal which actually was about 3 cowboys. They were 3 rodeo cowboys. One was African American and 2 other guys. And I wanted to write a book about some rodeo championship that happened, and I can't remember the year. And I wrote this fabulous proposal, and as happens, a quarter of the time, none of the publishers found Rodeo something that they wanted to pay money for me to write. So I said
to the agent, a quarter of the time. There are authors sitting out there that have written proposals for their great ideas to hundreds of publishers and never got response. And you say, I know, it's like talking to royalty, Peter. I got to say, what happens a quarter of the time I'm turned down? It's beautiful. I love it, by the way.
Well, it's not fun. It's not fun when that happens. You spent 2 months. You spent 2 months interviewing and writing a proposal, and then nobody buys the thing. That's not fun.
I know. There are people crying now. They've turned to tears, crying for the fact that it's no fun when it happens a quarter of the time. I love you, Peter, for that statement alone. Bye, guys. Thank you, everybody. Same time next week, same bat channel, same bat station.
Okay. All right. Take care, boys.
Okay, bat station.
Bye-bye.
It was
See you
fun,
next
Rob.
week.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. I'm glad you're having fun with this. Thank you both.
You're welcome.
Alan and Mark.
Awesome job.
On your part, too. And
lots of fun.
Thank you, Alan. Be good, everybody.
You too.
Take care, Alan.
You too, Mark.
Bye.
Bye-bye.